A couple of years ago, I posted a video on document headings in SAP Enable Now. Since then, I've refined my approach slightly, so I thought I'd post a quick update. In essence, my overall approach remains the same. I've just streamlined how I do things. Ultimately, what I want to be able to do is provide identifiable sections in my simulations to provide easier and more meaningful navigation for users, specifically by providing document headings and jump-in points on the progress bar. I always consider these two things together, the progress bar and the headings in the documentation, because usually they'll be exactly the same. What I want to use as a heading in the document is the same text I want to use for the jump-in points in the simulation. This simulation is a good example of that. In it, I'm explaining how to maintain your user profile in an SAP ECC 6.0 system. If you're not familiar with this transaction, don't worry. It's the mechanics of the simulation itself I want to look at. Now, in this transaction, there's three tabs that the user may need to maintain: Address, Defaults, and Parameters. And what I want to do is to provide a section heading for each of these tabs. Now, the first thing to note here is that by default, SAP Enable Now will insert a heading into the document for every step in the simulation, using the step name as the heading text. I don't like this. I want to be able to choose which steps I want to provide a heading for, because some steps are really continuations of the same activity, just like here where we have multiple steps on the same tab of the screen. I only want to have one heading for each tab. To do this, I need to tell SAP Enable Now to use the screen titles and not the step names for the headings. That's done in the documentation settings for the specific document type. Here, I'm going to use the training document as an example because it's nice and clean and it'll illustrate the point fairly well. In the documentation settings for this document type, under Project Content, there's a setting called Headings From. By default, this is set to Steps. I always change it to Screens. And the sole reason for doing this is that it is possible to suppress a heading based on a screen, but you can't suppress a heading that's based on a step. So using screens gives me much more flexibility. So far, so much as per the previous video. But I realized that I was excluding more screen-based headings than I was including. So I now have the default set to exclude the headings. This is done in the authoring settings under Macro Initialization, Screen. Here, in the documentation category, there's a setting of Use Title as Heading. By default, this is selected. I deselect this, which means that there will be no headings in the document unless I specifically include them. While we're here, remember that I always work on the document headings and the progress bar at the same time, keeping them consistent. So under Recording, in the Simulation/Documentation category, I make sure the Hide Steps in Progress display option is selected, which means that no steps will be shown as jump-in points on the progress bar unless I specifically choose them to be. So, back to the simulation. Now, I've already been through editing this one and entered suitable step names and screen titles. Both of these default to the screen name in the application during recording, but that's not usually very meaningful, so I always change them. And here's where I start thinking about my sections. All the steps I consider to be part of a single section or activity, I give exactly the same name, and for both the step and the screen. So here we have Specify the Transaction as the first section, Change Your Contact Details, which is everything on the Address tab, although there's only one action in this, as the next section. Then Change Your Defaults, which is actually 4 separate steps, all with exactly the same name here. And then we have Set Your Parameters on the Parameters tab, which is several more steps, and so on. Now for the clever part. I know that I really only want a heading in my document for every section, which is now whenever the step name and screen title changes. So I'll select the screen for my first real step, Specify the Transaction, and I'll select Use Title as Heading. Remember, I now have this set off by default. and then I just do the same thing every time the screen title changes. And to be more efficient, I can do this for all of the screens I'm interested in at the same time. So I'll click on Change Your Contact Details, then scroll down, Control-click on Change Your Defaults, scroll down to the next name change, which is Set Your Parameters, and Control-click on that screen, and so on every time the screen title changes. Once I've got all of these selected, I can just select Use Title as Heading for all of them at the same time. Very efficient. And because I like to have my progress bar use the same sections, I can do the same thing with all of the steps. Just select the individual steps that I want to be shown in the progress bar, which is every step where the name changes, which is very easy to see here, and then select Show in Progress Display for all of these at the same time. Now that we've done that, let's go and look at what these settings have done for us. First, I'll look at the simulation. I'll play this back in demo mode. And you can see that I now have jump-in points for all of my sections. Specify the transaction, change your contact details, change your defaults, and so on. And even though I don't have jump-in points for the other steps, their name is still shown on the left of the progress bar. But they're always the same within a section, which is logical for the user. Now let's go and look at the document. If I generate the training document, I can immediately see from the table of contents I've added to this that I now have meaningful headings. These are taken from the screen titles and are only included where I chose to include them, for my sections. So success, just what I wanted. But there's an additional refinement I typically make now. If you look at the action numbering here, you'll see that it restarts at 1 for each step, which is effectively for each screenshot. By default, with a new recording, you'll have 1 action per screenshot, so every action will be numbered 1. Here, I've already done some editing to merge steps, so it's not as bad, but still, I have numbering starting at 1 for every screenshot. And again, if you generally have 1 action per screenshot, that just looks odd. So there's a couple of things I can do about this. The first thing I do is adjust how actions are numbered in the document. We can do this in the settings for the document type. Going back to the documentation settings for the training document, in the numbering category, there's a setting called indexing. There's 2 types of value we can use for this setting: step and global. If we use one of the step options, numbering of the actions resets to 1 for each step. And if we use one of the global values, all of the actions in the entire document are numbered in a single continuous sequence. Now, in case you're wondering, the difference between all objects and highlights only is that with highlights only the actions that have a visible highlight on the screen will be numbered. Typically mouse clicks, input texts, because these are the ones that have the marker on the screenshot. By contrast, all objects will number every action, even if this doesn't have a highlight on the screen, which is typically true for keyboard actions. Personally, I now always use global all objects. So with that setting in place, let's regenerate our document. Now you can see that our numbering is indeed one continuous list all the way from the top to the bottom of the document, which is subjectively better. Now that may be all you want to do, but what I'd really like is to have each of my sections start numbering again at 1. And there's actually a feature that lets you do this. It's just not where you expect it to be. Let's go back to the simulation. Here I'm going to find each of my sections starts. The first section will start with 1, which is okay, so let's move on to the second one. Here I want to restart the action numbering at 1 again. So what I can do is insert a documentation macro of description. Now, this macro type's designed to add an extra paragraph of text into my document, and only into my document. It's a documentation macro, so it doesn't apply to the simulation playback. Now, I don't actually want an extra paragraph of text, But this macro has a handy property called Reset Global Index Counter. And if this is selected, the action numbers will start at 1 again from this point on, which is exactly what I want. I've already set this property to on in my authoring defaults, so I don't actually need to do anything here other than insert the macro. And again, I also want numbering to restart at 1 every time I have a heading. But here I can just copy the macro I just inserted and paste the copy wherever I need it, which is after change your content details, after set your parameters, and after save your changes. So now that I've got a documentation macro of description, which uses the Reset Global Index Counter setting, at the start of each of my sections, let's generate our document one last time and see what we now have. Here you can see we now have our sections identified by screen title headings still, and you can see that the numbering now actually does indeed start at 1 again after each heading, which is exactly what I want. So this is now the perfect document for me. Now, this may seem like a lot of effort, but it's not really. It just seems like it here because I've been taking you through it step by step and explaining the options. But in reality, all you need to do is, as you're going through changing your step names and screen titles to something meaningful, which you should absolutely be doing as a matter of course anyway, just watch out for where the name changes, and at these points, set Show in Progress display on for the step, set Use Title as heading on for the screen, and insert an empty description macro. And that's it. Very consistent. But that, combined with all the defaults I described I've set in my authoring settings and in the documentation settings, will give you this perfect document layout with all the good numbering and the headings every time. So, I hope you found that useful. If you did, consider subscribing to this channel for more tips and techniques on SAP Enable Now. Thanks for watching.